So thanks to Dr. Gillespie for the wonderful introduction. Thanks also to Kaliaset Amen and to Anita Spencer-Stevens, to the James Weldon Johnson Institute Fellows, and to everybody, really, your staff, the other faculty whose interests sustain this kind of intellectual environment, and thanks to the students who have come out. Even if your professors have encouraged you to come or maybe even promised you extra credit. It's really great to take part in the intellectual life of your university and your community. I also wanted to just give a thanks to the city of Atlanta for hosting this kind of conversation, and hopefully if there are any people who are not affiliated with Emory here, I like the idea of having the university as a place where anybody can come, and I also like writing about topics that engage people who would want to study and get the tools to study academically and critically topics in popular culture in the university setting, but a reason I also like the work I do is that it engages people who wouldn't necessarily participate in an academic setting. And it, having written Speculative Blackness, it's a book that I hope reaches people in classes and that people debate and think of and that inspires other scholarship. But I also really like that it can reach people who might not encounter it in a college classroom, but might know a little or a lot about the subjects it deals with. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. And give you a sense of what's in the book. But a lot of what I have to say today is not in the book, because I feel like you should be motivated to check out the book on these subjects and think about the intellectual tools you can use to think about these questions. But I also want to give you something that you couldn't just read in the text and deal with some issues that are a little more current than what's in the book that was published in February. So again, think about what's on your mind, think about what brought you here today, think about where you fit into this community and where your own intellectual life relates to these topics. And I hope that what I have to say really reaches you on any of those levels. I'm struggling now with a material problem that I don't answer directly through my scholarship in the book. I hope we can come together to appreciate the value of what we're doing at this site of teaching and learning and academic research as something distinct from the problems moving in and outside of the walls around us. The dilemma that was brought to my attention pretty recently is a precarious situation. It really borders on a state of emergency for some people who make their living by reading and writing and publishing the kind of material that stokes my interest, Black science fiction writers. According to a study by the Fireside Fiction Company, published on the web-based news aggregating platform Medium, anti-Black racism abounds in the publishing outlets that account for much of contemporary short fiction in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Of course, there are standouts and prize winners among Black speculative fiction authors who get their work published and receive critical acclaim, like Nnedi Okorafor, Walter Mosley, Tananarive Due. And their success plays no small part in opening the door for those few other Black authors who see their work make it into print in material form and online. But the account that the Fireside Fiction study makes clear is very simple. Out of 2,039 original stories published in 63 magazines in 2015, only 38 were written by Black authors. That's less than 2%. The median number of stories by Black authors in these magazines, the study goes on, is 0. That means that more than half of those 63 publications didn't publish a single story by a Black author in the year 2015. What I'm not going to do is debate the shape of the Earth or the direction of change in global temperatures or anything like that. The data is real, the methodology is real, the numbers are real, and the people are real. Ethan Robinson and Cecily Kane of Fireside Fiction do an excellent job of making their data freely accessible online, explaining their methodologies, and qualifying the claims they make. The 63 magazines in their study are not an exhaustive representation of all the creative work in all of the industries that we can consider speculative fiction, but it's significant that they account for over 2,000 original works of short fiction. When we look further afield, the findings in this report affirm the underlying conditions that have made it particularly difficult for Black people to pursue careers writing in the science fiction and fantasy genres as a fruitful source of livelihood or even a practical pastime. The problem's been looked at in various ways by scholars and practitioners for a generation. It was famously posed by author Samuel Delany in the New York Review of Science Fiction in 1998, and faced down again and again by authors like N.K. Jemisin, Craig Gidney, and Jennifer Brissett. I can also suggest another way to approach this dilemma. One of the tools I use in my course development and my research is the Internet Speculative Fiction Database, which catalogs the publication history of thousands of science fiction and fantasy texts from its earliest inklings into the foreseeable future, up to forthcoming works. If we were to take a big data approach to the kind of investigation that Fireside Fiction just published, we could probably use that database to visualize the short fiction published across a cross-section of science fiction and fantasy magazines for, let's say, 90 years, since the first issue of Amazing Stories, edited by Hugo Gernsback in 1926, up until today. And we could see whether or not Black authors' bylines show up 2% of the time, a little more, or a little less. Without doing that investigation, I can imagine that the trend line from 1926 up until today looks something like Thomas Piketty's analysis of wealth and income in Capital in the 21st Century, where he finds that a very small growth rate over time in the long run is critically meaningful as a social fact, even if it doesn't change much, because it illustrates that enduring structures stay the same unless structural change takes place. I'll return to this question later, but I suspect that providing a more comprehensive, quantitative account of racism in speculative fiction wouldn't make a noticeable difference in the way that we respond to the underlying question of what to do about it. So let me ask it another way. What does racism in speculative fiction have to do with racism in other areas of society? Speculative Blackness is my long-form answer to that question. By providing an account of how literature and popular media work in outlining the place of the particular narratives and tropes that make up science fiction, fantasy, and utopia on these sectors of the cultural landscape, I try to put the kinds of questions that African American literature scholars ask on the agenda of science fiction studies, and vice versa. For the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to discuss some of my efforts to address these questions about how we envision the future, what significance we assign to racial identity in different cultural endeavors, and how we participate in culture, using examples some of you will recognize, and others that were my pleasure to excavate from previous moments in the development of speculative fiction across media. Over the course of the 20th century, science fiction and fantasy reflected and also obscured the imaginative traditions of Black culture. The version of the genre's history that I rely on starts with pulp magazines, but it quickly expands out to comic books, television, fan fiction, and blockbuster movies that gross billions of dollars on the international stage. Within the book, I emphasize the importance of this journey of speculative fiction from marginal to popular in the American imagination. While I won't belabor the point here, I think it's important to take exception to the notion that science fiction is a less respected or underappreciated genre. That's true in some quarters, but from my point of view, in light of the problems I outlined above, and in light of the statistics we see today, it only seems like a primary dilemma at the intersection of speculative fiction and literary criticism is a matter of cultural prestige and academic respect from universities if you have a very insular view of intellectual practice. Because African Americans have been systematically excluded from participation in so many enterprises, our interpretive practices, the way we read, the way we think, the way we dream, have evolved by circumnavigating the field of cultural production, by jumping over or tunneling underneath or breaking through the boundaries between more respected and less respected varieties of knowledge, practice, and creative thought. So with the toolkit that comes from the Black intellectual tradition in hand, I take a different outlook on what it means for text to be valuable and what the task of cultural criticism should be. It might be difficult to determine who the authors of all of the published short fiction in the history of speculative fiction magazines were, even if we wanted to undertake that kind of analysis. One reason for this is that finding photographs or even reliable phenotypic and demographic descriptions of many authors across many decades is a painstaking task to contemplate. It's a lot of work. But another reason is that there are bound to be discrepancies between the real historical individuals who saw their work published in various magazines and anthologies, and the authors whose names populate the historical record. More than one author might use the same name, and some authors will use many different names. I hazard to say that this is an especially significant problem when it comes to science fiction and fantasy. While online publishing and social media complicate the politics of anonymity today, there's a long tradition of writing using pseudonyms in print. The first chapter of Speculative Blackness emerges out of this genealogy, and in a way, my project of revisiting moments in the history of the genre as it developed across media grows out of the same roots. One of the watershed developments in speculative fiction that informs my work is the feminist science fiction movement. Although some of you might know this already, the 1970s saw an explosion of women's writing in a variety of genres, including science fiction and fantasy, spurred in part by new connections that female fans of science fiction texts made with one another at science fiction conventions, and sustained in tandem with grassroots feminist movements in the era. The moment jump-started the careers of superb authors who are too numerous to name, but a few of them are critically important to the discussion at hand: Pamela Zoline, Ursula Le Guin, Marlene Barr, as well as Virginia Hamilton, Jewel Gomez, and Octavia Butler. The latter are African-American women. Today, there's a literary prize for speculative fiction that expands or explores our understanding of gender that's named after a feminist science fiction writer, the James Tiptree Jr. Award. James Tiptree is not one of the women I just mentioned. Rather, this was the alter ego of Alice B. Sheldon, who chose a male pen name to publish intriguing science fiction texts with titles like The Women Men Can't See and The Girl Who Was Plugged In. One of my students at Drexel wrote a wonderful senior thesis on gender, embodiment, and theories of post-humanism that dealt with that last story by Tiptree. A stellar biography of Alice Sheldon by Julie Phillips recounts Sheldon's upbringing and her career in print in the persona of James Tiptree, including the author's bisexual desires and the eventual disclosure to her peers that her male persona only existed in writing. What I found most compelling on the way to investigating the subject of how writers perform racial identification through their literary work were two aspects of Alice Sheldon's life that are really under-theorized, under-explored in Phillips's biography. First, Sheldon's parents, who were travel writers, took her on tour with them through Congo and other parts of Central and East Africa while they pursued their occupations, relaying the wonders of the people, the flora and fauna that they encountered for white American and European readers. She was just a child then, but that wanderlust stayed with her throughout her life. She later served in the Army, in Air Force intelligence, and for the CIA. She wrote about Soviet activity in African nations. Phillips presents this subject incredibly briefly in her biography of Alice Sheldon, focusing more on her personal life and on the controversy over the Tiptree persona. But I can't help but think that those experiences growing up as a child, traveling through parts of the Dark Continent, shaped the worldview that James Tiptree brought to science fiction writing. Military and political involvement, histories of traveling the world and developing a worldview in political terms is a prominent consideration when it comes to the careers of other science fiction writers like L. Ron Hubbard, Gene Roddenberry, and Robert Heinlein, but it doesn't come up much in stories about James Tiptree. Turning towards something I was able to understand more fully, I also learned that Sheldon used different objects in order to portray each of her persona in writing. Phillips notes in the biography that she wrote letters on cream-colored personal stationery using her married name. And she used two different typewriters for submissions in the name of James Tiptree and for a female author persona she invented who was meant to be Tiptree's protege. The name of that pseudonym was Raccoona Sheldon. Phillips refers to Raccoona Sheldon as a woman writer with a mask. The material objects that make up the James Tiptree phenomenon are leads that I'm inclined to follow because they remind us that gender is both constructed in our minds and performed by what our bodies say about us and what we do with our bodies and the bodies of others, by the people with whom we interact, and by the objects, not even people, but typewriters, paper, pens, and ink, in relation to which we make ourselves in the world. As my student advisee, Melody, noted in her writing about feminist science fiction and cyberpunk, queer cyberpunk images have the potential to provide a framework for thinking about gender in ways that can eliminate the need to talk about it in a binary, providing instead a series of parts, both physical and mental, that can be fit together to make as many genders as there are people, genders that are not artificial, hyphenated identities, but holistic circuits that combine the distinct parts of gender, body, and desire into unique and self-contained identities. If Sheldon or Tiptree's example shows us that there might be as many sexes, genders, and human bodies as there are people, each made up of biological and technological parts drawn from a shared cultural repertoire, then she also shows us that there are just as many genres of writing as there are texts or textual objects. Certainly, the same has to be true for the way that we perform our racial identities through writing, the materials we use to fashion ourselves, the modes of expression available to us, the way we move our bodies and speak, the idiomatic repertoire, the figures of speech and habits of using language, and the code-switching practices we employ, all signal to others that we're aware of the cultural scripts operating in our intimate relationships, at our jobs, and in the sites of our different political entanglements. Speculative fiction can help us to think about this, to represent the disassembling and reconfiguring of human bodies, either as the premise of a fantastic story, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or Octavia Butler's stories, Bloodchild and her Xenogenesis novels, or in the ways that authors talk about themselves and talk about their work. In her last novel, Fledgling, Butler introduces a long-lived clan of vampires whose goal is to live in the daylight. Her account of the transformation that they make is simple. Before an audience once, while she was writing Fledgling, she asked, and I'm paraphrasing here, what's the evolutionary adaptation that enhances your ability to withstand exposure to sunlight that vampires would want to develop in order to live a 24-hour day? Melanin. So it's not just the content, but also the way that texts are written and published, and the way we talk about them, that provides object lessons in thinking critically about who we say we are. We're all, in a way, crisscrossed with the power lines that make our identities meaningful, and we're bound up with the desires of those who desire us. Little pieces of who and what we desire exist within us all the time. If you've ever used the expression, letting someone rent space in your head, then you know what I mean. Conceptualizing the way that writers represent themselves in truth claims and in various social fictions moves me toward another touchstone in my exploration of literary biography and the construction of identity in science fiction. K. Leslie Steiner was a little-known collaborator with the well-known Black author Samuel R. Delany. If you read Delany's 1979 fantasy novel, Tales of Neverion, or its sequels, or his 1989 critical text, The Straits of Messina, you'll meet Steiner as the persona he introduced to act as an alter ego. Steiner was ostensibly a Black woman born in Cuba and a tenured academic whose commentaries on Delany's writing create a pseudoscientific and imaginary archaeological context for his sword and sorcery adventures featuring a hero named Gorgic the Barbarian. Steiner allegedly specializes in a form of category theory that helps contemporary linguists interpret a form of ancient Greek writing on an artifact relevant to the story Delany is telling. She acts as an analog for the reclusive, antiquarian, eccentric scholars in the weird fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, who are themselves successors to the learned gentlemen and ladies who witnessed marvelous wonder in earlier tales by H.G. Wells and in the socialist and feminist utopias of the late 19th century. We're told that the artifact Steiner is called on to demystify communicates some knowledge of the prehistoric world in which the Neverion stories take place. First of all, Delany is Steiner. That's clear. But you don't always know Delany is Steiner. You might figure it out, though. The name Neverion, the setting of his stories, is a linguistic pun, right? It's a combination of the words never and yon, right? Never is the time, and yon is where it is. I like to think of yon or yonder as a synonym for aquel in Spanish, meaning like not this one, and not that one, but like that one. Yon. That's where Neverion is, meaning it doesn't have a real archaeological record. But in addition, Steiner's biography, which Delany introduces through another pseudonym, introducing her as the interpreter of his work in an appendix to the novels, her biography includes a joint appointment in math and comparative literature at the actual University of Michigan. It's easily falsifiable if you're reading it in 1979. Given the precarious history of Black women's professional advancement in American research universities, the background that Delany has invented for his counterpart is a museum-quality forgery, right? If K. Leslie Steiner existed, we would know about her. But the point is not that Delany intends to deceive the reader, but that in inventing this fiction, he's drawing us into how to interpret his work as a complicated exercise in metafiction. Although I don't write much about Delany's fiction, I love it. His critical work, though, is captivating. He displays a genius for Marxist and deconstructive analysis in his accounts of how fantasy and science fiction illustrate economic modes of production in transition, and in his essays on sex culture in New York, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. You can observe his many aptitudes in Fred Barney Taylor's documentary, The Polymath. Delany's own critical acumen undoubtedly informs Steiner's fictionalized knowledge base, and it's intriguing that his alter ego, who is a woman, is also African American. The same is true for the protagonist of his 2007 novel that many critics consider autobiographical, Dark Reflections. The protagonist of that novel is an African American poet and underemployed professor living in New York. Blackness is never the only facet of identity in play in Delany's writing, but it's always relevant. He manages to find us in a variety of mundane and far-fetched situations, from writing genres to distant planets. Scholars Jeffrey Tucker and Sharon DeGraw explore the significance of race in his writing a great deal in other books. But the account of imaginary identities that I explore in Speculative Blackness focuses on those material aspects of an author's literary persona. While the pen name and fictitious biography appear in appendices to Delany's published novels, Steiner first came into existence as an amateur rather than a professional writer and critic. K. Leslie Steiner originated as the name under which Delany and other authors using pseudonyms, including Joanna Russ, a feminist science fiction author, would write about each other's work in an amateur-published fan magazine called Venom. Venom was a vehicle for these successful professional writers to take liberties with their relationships with readers and with each other, to say scathing things about each other's work, all in good fun, without the accountability of the market. Although Delany's example with Steiner is highly contrived, it underscores how the flexible positions of authors and readers, the shifting continuum between amateur and professional varieties of interpretation, allow us to tell a variety of stories about the participatory nature of speculative fiction. The possibility that you can grow up reading science fiction magazines or comic books, sending letters to their writers, artists, and editors, and eventually join them with a career in the industry is a treasured myth in the area of culture that Delany calls paraliterary. I like to think of it as literary adjacent. And this myth about social mobility and popular culture permits a great deal of speculation about who writers and readers are. While up until the 1990s, critics had confronted this notion of flexibility and authors engaging with the audience by portraying contemporary media as a site of participatory culture where readers' and viewers' interpretations matter just as much as the market in determining the critical reputation of popular texts. I've always been inclined to think of social mobility in terms of race. As the examples before illustrate, reception and fan culture matters a great deal to science fiction authors' participation in a genre tradition, in their sense that they belong to a community. Whether they are part of a cohort of authors who can be considered part of the new wave, like Delany and Pamela Zoline, and whether their writing has some essentially masculine or some essentially feminist mode of expression, like James Tiptree or James Tiptree. It depends on the way that readers categorize them, as well as the way that they portray themselves, down to the granular level of what kind of paper and ink they use to make their mark on the literary profession. The main focus of my original research on this subject is a successor to the James Tiptree Literary Award, the namesake of an organization called the Carl Brandon Society. The Carl Brandon Society also gives awards like the Tiptree organization. Their mission is to advance speculative fiction writing that contributes to readers' understanding of race and to reward exemplary science fiction and fantasy writing by authors of color. Just as there was no male feminist author named James Tiptree, Carl Brandon is the name of a black writer who didn't exist. His story goes back to the 1950s. The incident at the center of my attention in the first chapter of Speculative Blackness is the strange career of an imaginary Negro writer who made a name for himself in a national organization for science fiction and fantasy fans. Because fans corresponded through the mail, and relatively few of them ever met each other in person outside of their own geographic region, or on the fortuitous occasion of traveling to a national convention, the biographical details they knew about each other consisted to a large degree of stories they told about themselves in print. As we grapple with the stakes of anonymity and geographical displacement in communication today, we can learn something from the piles of fanzines and letters of comment on cheap yellowing paper from half a century ago. In the mid-1950s, while segregation was still enforced throughout the country, but under renewed legal scrutiny, some members of a science fiction and fantasy fan organization found themselves embroiled in a controversy over their own prejudices. Assuming they were all white because they'd never provided any evidence to the contrary, this group of fans from California to Wisconsin, in the Northeast, and some of them overseas, confronted a crisis when one of their number asked if they would accept an application for membership in the group, which was hundreds strong, if that application came from a Negro. Essentially, the provocateur wanted to remind his peers that for all their pretense to enlightened principles, they were probably just as narrow-minded as the anti-Semites and the supporters of Joseph McCarthy in their ranks, who were fed up with the disdain that they felt from their liberal counterparts. He had a point in challenging them with that question, because if the organization wasn't practicing racial exclusion, if they weren't just as narrow-minded as others, then why didn't they have any black members already? This controversy resulted in the brief, wondrous life of Carl Joshua Brandon, the first black member and very nearly the chief executive officer of the Fantasy Amateur Press Association, the first and largest organization for science fiction and fantasy fans in the United States. In short, after the provocation to confront an application for membership from a Negro, a few members of the organization, who had already been using a pseudonym, Carl Brandon, to submit some materials to fan magazines in the name of a made-up roommate they decided was part of their group, decided they would respond to this racial challenge by having their fictitious friend, Carl Brandon, Dave's roommate, whose name their fellows had already seen in print, identify himself as black. Not only did they create a situation that made the question a moot point by assigning blackness to the identity of a person everybody already assumed was already present, but they also revised their assumptions about who was a member of their group. It turns out their group wasn't all white to begin with. Animated by a desire to be an inclusive community on the one hand, and by a desire to expose and affirm the validity of the exclusion they were practicing on the other, this group of white writers, ranging in age from their late teens to senior citizenship, contorted themselves in believing in the literary genius of a man who never existed, and doubling down on the belief that their cultural taste and critical demeanor were shared with their imaginary black friend. In the Chronicle of Carl Brandon, a personality whose name became associated with a group of white fanzine writers from the San Francisco Bay Area, we learned that if the Negro had not existed, it would be necessary to invent him. The fictitious Carl Brandon was best known for writing short treatments of current and past literary works that satisfied fanzine writers' desire to insert themselves into the stories they consumed. From classics like The Wizard of Oz to recent science fiction novels like Slan by A.E. Van Vogt and Brainwave by Paul Anderson, Brandon's inventors signed his name to hilarious stories that replaced the characters and tropes of the original texts with familiar fixtures from the lives of their fellow science fiction fans. As a kind of amateur criticism, these fan fictions recognized the recurring metaphors, plot formulas, and character roles that made popular works appealing as types. They emptied these powerful signs of their contents and substituted them with imaginary personalities and qualities drawn from fanzine and science fiction culture, inside jokes that only they would recognize. The result was a kind of sophisticated literary criticism in drag. Brandon's best-loved work, a parody of The Catcher in the Rye, played up the cynicism and short-sightedness of Holden Caulfield, while packing his story full of innuendos about being kicked out of his fan organization instead of being kicked out of prep school, and drinking rye instead of coming through it, as in the Robert Burns poem. The people-hunting hat that Holden Caulfield wears in the book is replaced by a propeller beanie, an icon of fan culture that writers use to poke fun at themselves as practitioners of an amateur and childish pursuit. In lieu of phony, the protagonist calls his detractors fake fans, one word, the worst of insults among his peers. In the carnival of fan fiction parodies, mad scientists become obsessive editors, life-changing inventions become high-speed mimeograph machines, and the moral arc of a hero's self-discovery gets replaced with gentle ribbing directed at well-known personalities within the fan subculture. In one instance, the fans perpetrating the hoax of Carl Brandon identify him as the author of a parody of Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road, which had only been out for a few months at the time. Rather than searching for spiritual fulfillment, the protagonist hitchhikes from one science fiction convention to another, learning about local characters and hanging out in hotel rooms along the way. Many readers at the time noted that they were only inspired to read the newly published novel by Kerouac after entertaining themselves with Brandon's parody of it. Unearthing the work published in fanzines in the 1950s teaches some unexpected lessons about the heterogeneity of audiences and the unexpected readings that arise at the intersection of genres. The impulse to identify Carl Brandon as Black arises out of a desire among white fans to perform for other white fans enlightened racial attitudes. By appending the descriptive term Negro to an otherwise unremarkable but well-liked persona, the reading and writing community who invented Carl Brandon achieved more than just perpetrating a hoax. They introduced a particular idea of race, driven by a hypothesis that racial identity would be utterly immaterial to writing, personality, and interpersonal interactions of a Black member in their community, and it left an enduring legacy. When the hoax was finally revealed in an incident that exposed that the handwriting identified with Carl Brandon belonged to someone they knew, fellow fans congratulated the perpetrators for pulling off such an incredible trick, and they mourned the loss of the unique creativity identified with his persona. However, they never took stock of the realization that they hadn't achieved racial inclusion. They could no longer congratulate themselves for believing, under false pretenses, that nothing about their community would have to change in order to facilitate the participation of Black people. A few works that were written before the hoax was resolved appeared in fanzines under his name, but later, the imaginary Black member of the fan community became a professional author, with the publication of a short story with his byline in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in 1962. Carl Brandon teaches us that our objects of desire have a certain power over us. If we want to believe that Black people can participate in a literary market or even inhabit the same audience spaces as white readers on an equitable basis, without anything about these spaces changing, we might concede to certain consensual illusions in order to reinforce the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. That aspect of the Carl Brandon phenomenon brings to mind a subplot in a feature film. George Lucas's first, and as far as I'm concerned, his best feature film is titled THX 1138. The movie, which was released in 1971, depicts a sterile anti-utopia like Brave New World, in which survivors of a global catastrophe live underground. With shades of Aldous Huxley, the denizens of this subterranean world are forced to take powerful drugs to keep them under control. A chase ensues when one inhabitant rebels, refusing to submit to the mandatory drug treatment and falling in love with her cellmate. While they're attempting to reach the outside world and defy the controls on them, the rebels witness a Black man, formerly a hologram, meant to appease fantasies in the all-white population, escaping from his virtual containment. Just grew, I guess. Seeing a real-life Black individual leaves the escapees surprised, but largely unfazed. I always found that holographic Negro, played by Don Pedro Cooley, very compelling. It was as if the injury that an authoritarian society did to itself, stripping people of the capacity to love and to feel, could only really be symptomatized by seeing some internal part of its humanity taken out of itself. The genocide of actual Black people, required to create this nightmare society that was lily white, reduces Blackness to a ghost in the machine, a trace in the text, a figment of the imagination. When the Black hologram emerges, he's like a waking dream, a piece of the human soul detached from itself. But we're not externalized fragments of white people's souls. We have dreams of our own. In light of this complicated history of real and imagined Black writers entering the ranks of a largely white literary community, the question that stays with me is, what happens to a dream deferred? Why are dreams so powerful? The plot that allows denizens of a repressive society to break free in THX 1138 is also similar to the point of departure for the Kenyan short film Pumzi. Pumzi opens with a dream sequence of a character we will learn is a scientist, witnessing a verdant landscape and a flourishing tree, which of course needs water to live. But she quickly wakes up to a terrible robotic voice telling her, "Take your dream suppressants." She lives in an entirely enclosed, artificial built environment, working at a museum dedicated to the natural life that used to exist in the outside world. Pumzi takes place in a setting where the earth has been devastated by radiation and lives in a state of permanent drought. When the scientist attempts to revive a plant using a mysterious soil sample and precious water, including the sweat from her own body, the authorities reprimand her. They have her arrested when they find out that she has been dreaming. "Take your dream suppressants," they insist over a video screen. While fantastic narratives that represent Black life as a moral warning sign or a cipher for white political attitudes present critical opportunities to comment on the way that popular media turns our imaginations inside out, creative works like Pumzi are surreal. We should remember, surrealism was not just a movement in the arts, but a whole aesthetic philosophy. As Robin Kelly wrote in Freedom Dreams, surrealism was an international revolutionary movement concerned with the emancipation of thought. Its objective was breaking down the boundaries between everyday life and our wildest dreams. The best representation of surrealism in Black thought that I've ever encountered, that I teach in my classes, comes from the work of Martinican author Suzanne Césaire. She writes, "Surrealist activity is total activity, the only one capable of liberating humankind by revealing the unconscious, an activity that will help free the peoples of the world. I am thinking also of tomorrow. Millions of Black hands will hoist their terror across the furious skies of world war. Freed from a long, benumbing slumber, the most disinherited of all peoples will rise up from plains of ashes. Our surrealism will enable us to finally transcend the sordid antinomies of the present, whites, Blacks, Europeans, Africans, civilized savages. Surrealism, tightrope of our hope." You may find Césaire most easily through her husband, Aimé Césaire, who is credited, along with Léopold Senghor, of founding the movement of negritude. Throughout the book, I discuss moments where the signature tropes of fantasy and science fiction, other worlds, time travel, artificial life, and things of that nature, emerge out of Black diasporic, ancestral, or other minoritarian frames of reference. Some examples include the syncretic spiritual practices, radical aesthetic praxis of musical innovators like Anthony Braxton and Sun Ra, and the utopian thought of Martin Delany and Sutton Griggs. I call this tradition the speculative fiction of Blackness, and I think of it as a necessary counterpart to the exclusionary dynamic that I name as the whiteness of science fiction. The vitality of endeavors that lend themselves to the fantastic genres demonstrate that whiteness has no monopoly on science, reason, and intellectual speculation, and by the same token, there's no rarefied expressive talent for rendering reality endemic to the Negro race. The speculative fiction of Blackness is a way to put distinctly Black cultural practices in dialogue with concepts of literary genre that don't always afford them much attention. We may not be able to find Black authors all the time. If we look, in the places we always look. Sometimes we have to dream ourselves where we need to be, to insert ourselves into the stories told by others, or to change the roles into which we're enlisted. I highlight this kind of work throughout Speculative Blackness, from Nichelle Nichols performing the role of Uhura on television's Star Trek, which inspires contemporary Black artist Simone Lee to recreate her image in a larger-than-life scale in video installations, to the Marvel comic superhero Storm, enduring over 40 years in print, inspiring Black fans of all shades, sizes, genders, and backgrounds to show up and show out at science fiction conventions, Comic-Cons, and Tumblrs. Even when we're not authors of the performances enacted in our names, the participatory traditions of science fiction and fantasy provide us with methods and motivations to assert ownership over the narratives that matter to us. As we make inroads into the professional associations and the media platforms that demonstrate the critical value of our authorship, there's absolutely no room for doubt that the audience for the future of race and science fiction is already here, in classrooms, on timelines, and in the streets. The genius of what Blackness will do waits, dreaming. Thank you.